My name is Nadia Osei. I'm 34 years old. And the moment my family decided my work was a joke, they didn't even lower their voices to say it. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, my parents' house in Charlotte, North Carolina. The kind of fall day where the light comes through the kitchen windows at a long angle, and everything looks warmer than it actually is. My mother had made jollof rice and fried plantains, and the table was full the way it always was when my brother Marcus was in town. His girlfriend, his business partner, two cousins who drove up from Colombia. Everyone dressed nicely, everyone loud, everyone happy in the way people get when the family favorite has come home. I had driven 2.5 hours to be there. I want to say that up front. I drove 2.5 hours because my mother had called and said, "Nadia, Marcus is only here for the weekend. Please come." So I came. I brought a bottle of wine nobody touched, and a folder I had been carrying everywhere for 3 weeks like it was something fragile. The folder held a printed summary of my pilot data, 47 pages. 6 months of work compressed into something I thought I could finally share with people who were supposed to be proud of me. I had been building a soil monitoring system. Not glamorous, I know. It wasn't an app. It wasn't something you could show off at a dinner party. It was a small wireless sensor network designed to track moisture levels, nutrient depletion, and early signs of contamination in agricultural soil, specifically for smallholder farmers who couldn't afford the large commercial systems that only served industrial operations. The goal was simple: give smaller farms access to the same early warning data that big farms had, catch problems before they became crop failures, help people who were one bad harvest away from losing everything get a fighting chance. I had been working on it for 4 years, not as a hobby, as a company. I had registered it properly, filed patents, run 2 pilot programs with farming cooperatives in rural Georgia and central North Carolina, and spent the last 8 months in conversations with an agricultural development nonprofit that was considering integrating our system into their work across 3 states. Nobody in my family knew any of that. Not because I was hiding it, because nobody had asked. Marcus knew I had a startup. He called it my science project, always with a smile that made the word sound affectionate enough that you couldn't technically object to it. My father, Charles, knew I had left a stable engineering job 2 years earlier and had been working on something related to farming, which he found puzzling since no one in our family was a farmer. My mother, Gloria, had a carefully maintained position of supportive neutrality, which in practice meant she asked how I was sleeping and whether I was eating enough, and never once asked what I was actually building. That Sunday, about 40 minutes into lunch, Marcus started talking about his investment portfolio. He had done well in commercial real estate over the past 5 years, and he talked about it the way people do when success has become so normal to them that they forget other people might not find it interesting. His business partner jumped in. His girlfriend nodded. The cousins asked questions. I ate my rice and waited. At some point, my mother looked across the table at me and said, "Nadia, tell Marcus about your little project." She meant it kindly, but the word little arrived before anything else, and it landed the way it always did. I opened the folder. I said I had been building a soil monitoring system for smallholder farms, that we had completed 2 pilot programs, that early results were showing meaningful reduction in water waste and earlier detection of nutrient problems, that we were in active conversations with a nonprofit partner that worked with over 2,000 small farms in the Southeast. The table was quiet for about 3 seconds. Then Marcus said, "So it's like a gardening sensor." His business partner laughed once. His girlfriend smiled at her plate. My father set down his fork. "Nadia," he said slowly, "what is the revenue model for something like this? Farmers don't have money." I told him we were operating on a grant and partnership model initially, with a transition to a low-cost subscription structure for cooperatives. He nodded the way people nod when they've already decided not to listen. That sounds very complicated for very little return. Marcus leaned back in his chair. He looked at me with something that wasn't cruelty exactly. More like the casual certainty of someone who has never been wrong about money in front of this family. He said, "Nadia, I say this because I love you. Nobody is going to pay real money for a dirt sensor. This isn't Silicon Valley. This is soil. You should think about whether this is worth another few years of your life." I looked down at the folder, 47 pages. My cousin, Adaze, who is 22 and has never worked a day outside of retail, laughed softly and said, "Maybe she can pivot to houseplants." Everyone at the table found that funnier than it deserved. I didn't argue. I didn't pull out the pilot data. I didn't list the patents or explain the partnership conversations or describe what it meant to a family in rural Georgia when they caught a contamination problem 6 weeks earlier than they would have otherwise. I closed the folder, I put it beside my chair, I ate the rest of my lunch without saying much. Before I left that evening, my mother walked me to my car. She hugged me and whispered, "Don't be upset with Marcus, he means well." Then she pulled back and looked at me with the gentle worry that had been her primary expression toward me for years. She said, "Maybe your father has a point about the return. You're 34, Nadia. It might be time to think about stability." I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat, the whole 2.5 hours. I kept glancing at it in the dark the way you look at something you need to keep believing in when the people closest to you have just finished telling you why you shouldn't. If you've ever sat in a car and argued with yourself about whether to keep going just to remember what it felt like, if you've ever been underestimated by the exact people who were supposed to know you best, stay with me. Because what happened 9 months later changed everything, and not one person at that table saw it coming. I want to go back further than that Sunday lunch. Because that afternoon didn't come out of nowhere. It was just the loudest version of something that had been happening quietly for years. I grew up in Charlotte as the second of 2 children. Marcus is 4 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to understand what attention looked like in a family, I understood that his portion of it was larger than mine. Not because my parents were cruel people, they weren't. They were hardworking, practical, proud in the way that first-generation families often are, people who measured safety in salaries and titles and the absence of uncertainty. My father came from Ghana at 26 with an engineering degree and rebuilt his credibility from scratch in a country that didn't automatically recognize it. My mother worked in hospital administration for 31 years. They understood effort. What they didn't always understand was the kind of effort that didn't come with a clear finish line. Marcus gave them finish lines. He was the kind of person who moved in straight, visible steps. Good grades, then a business degree, then a job, then a promotion, then his own firm. Every milestone announced and celebrated. Every achievement framed and hung on the wall of the family narrative. He wasn't unkind to me growing up. He was just always ahead, always approved of, always the reference point my parents used when they talked about what success was supposed to look like. I was the one who took longer, who changed her major twice, who left a stable engineering job at 32 to do something nobody in the family could easily explain at church or at dinner parties, who lived alone in Raleigh in a one-bedroom apartment that my mother visited once and described as very spare, the way people describe something they find sad but don't want to say so directly. The soil monitoring system was called GroundTrue. I had incorporated it properly as a limited liability company 2.5 years before that Sunday lunch. I had a small advisory board, a part-time hardware engineer named Kofi, who had worked in precision agriculture before, and a data scientist named Priya, who had joined me after her contract with a water management firm ended. We were not a large team. We were not a funded team. Not yet. But we were a real one. The idea had come from a conversation I had during my last year at the engineering firm with a county extension agent named Mr. Delray, who worked with small farms in a rural part of Rowan County. He was describing how a family had lost most of their soybean crop that year to a drainage problem that had been building for weeks. The signs had been there, he said, in the soil behavior, in the moisture patterns, but the family didn't have the equipment to read them, and by the time the problem was visible to the naked eye, it was already too late to recover the season. I kept thinking about that family after I drove home that evening. I thought about them for weeks. I knew the technology to detect those patterns early existed. It was just designed for large commercial operations that could afford the infrastructure. What didn't exist was a version built for smaller farms, affordable, low maintenance, wireless, with alerts simple enough that a farmer without a technical background could act on them. That was GroundTrue. That was the whole idea. I spent the first year building the hardware prototype with Kofi in a space we rented inside a small maker facility in Durham. We failed more than we succeeded. Our first sensor array drifted badly in high humidity conditions, which is not a minor problem when you're building something meant to live in the ground. Our second version had a connectivity issue that made it unreliable at the distances we needed. Our third version worked, mostly, and it was the one we took into the field. The first pilot was in Harnett County, North Carolina, a farming cooperative with 11 member families, mostly tobacco, transitioning to vegetable crops. We placed 43 sensors across 6 fields over a growing season and monitored soil moisture, nitrogen levels, and temperature gradients. We caught 2 significant drainage problems early. We flagged a nutrient imbalance in one field that the farmer had been attributing to seed quality. The cooperative manager, a woman named Doris, who had been farming that land for 30 years, called me after the second month and said something I wrote down on a notepad and kept on my desk. She said, "This is the first time I felt like the land was actually talking to me." I kept that note through every difficult month that followed. The second pilot came through a referral from the first, a cooperative in Tift County, Georgia. Larger, more complex terrain, more variables, harder. We had 2 sensor failures in the first 3 weeks. Kofi drove down on a weekend to replace the units by hand. Priya rebuilt part of our data processing model after we realized our alert thresholds were miscalibrated for a different soil type. It cost us time and money we didn't have a lot to spare, but we finished the pilot, and the results were good enough that the nonprofit I mentioned, an organization called Fieldwork Alliance that supported sustainable agriculture development across the Southeast, asked for a formal presentation. None of this was secret. I would have told my family any of it, all of it, if they had ever asked a real question. Not how are you doing with your little project, or are you sure this is sustainable? A real question. Something that started with, tell me how it works, or what does the data actually show, or what happens if a farmer gets an alert at 2 in the morning? Nobody asked those questions. My father asked about revenue. My mother asked about my sleep. Marcus made a joke about gardening sensors and went back to talking about his portfolio. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being unseen by people who are physically present in your life. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It just sits with you. It follows you home on a 2.5-hour drive. It makes you glance at a folder on the passenger seat in the dark. After the Sunday lunch, I made a decision that I didn't announce to anyone. I stopped mentioning GroundTrue to my family at all, not because I was hurt, or not only because of that, but because I had started to understand that their doubt had become a weight I was carrying into my work, and I could not afford it anymore. Every time I explained something and watched them not quite listen, some small part of my energy went toward managing their discomfort instead of building what I was trying to build. So I stopped explaining. I focused. I answered Fieldwork Alliance's questions. I submitted the expanded pilot data. I worked with Kofi and Priya on the third hardware generation, which was lighter, cheaper to manufacture, and had a battery life that finally made large-scale deployment realistic. I applied for a USDA Small Business Innovation Grant. I waited. 2 months after that lunch, the grant came through. $114,000. I sat in my apartment at 7 in the morning reading the award letter, and I didn't call anyone in my family. I made coffee, I called Kofi, I called Priya. I sat with it quietly like something I wanted to protect before the world got loud around it. That was the version of my life they knew nothing about. The version with real numbers, real partners, real results, and real forward movement. They thought they knew me. They had known who I was at 25. They had never thought to ask who I had become. The grant changed what we could do, but it didn't change how my family saw me. I hadn't expected it to because I hadn't told them. And for a few months, that felt like the right decision. I was quieter at family events, more careful with what I shared. I showed up when I was supposed to, ate the food, asked the questions, and drove home without opening the folder. Then something happened that made staying quiet feel less like a choice and more like a trap. It was a Saturday in late January. My mother called in the morning, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that she sounded carefully casual in the way she only does when she is managing toward something. She said she wanted me to come to dinner the following weekend. She said Marcus would be there and that he had a colleague he wanted me to meet. A man named Daniel, mid-30s, recently divorced, stable career in finance. She used the word settled 3 times in 4 sentences. I told her I would think about it. She said, Nadia, you're 34. Thinking about it is not the same as living your life. I didn't argue. I told her I would let her know. I spent the rest of that morning sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of tea that went cold. I wasn't angry about the setup. I was tired in a different way. The kind of tired that comes not from working hard, but from being misread consistently by people who have decided the story of you before you finished writing it. My mother's version of my life was a woman approaching 35 who had made unconventional choices and needed gentle redirection toward the things that would actually matter: a good match, stability, a life that looked like something she could describe without a long explanation. She had no idea I had filed 2 additional patents in the past 4 months. She had no idea that Fieldwork Alliance had formally proposed an integration partnership that would put GroundTrue sensors on farms across Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. She had no idea that I had spent the previous Thursday in a conference room in Atlanta presenting our data to a room of 12 people, including the Southeast Regional Director of a federal agricultural development program, and that at the end of the meeting he had shaken my hand and said the methodology was among the most practical he had seen for this scale of operation. She didn't know any of it because nobody in my family had created the conditions where I felt safe telling them. And somewhere in those months of silence, I had stopped mourning that gap and started simply working within it. But the phone call about Daniel sat differently than the dinner table jokes had. This was my family actively trying to redirect my life based on a version of me they had invented and were no longer bothering to update. It wasn't cruelty. It was something almost worse. It was complete indifference to the possibility that they might be wrong about who I was. I didn't go to that dinner. I sent my mother a short text that evening saying I had a work conflict. She replied with one line: "Work. Right." The period at the end of that sentence did more damage than she probably intended. 2 weeks later, Marcus called me directly. He almost never called me directly. He said he wanted to check in. I let him talk for a few minutes about his projects, about the Charlotte property market, about a trip he was planning. Then he said, "Mom is worried about you." I told him she didn't need to be. He said, "Nadia, I'm going to be honest with you because I think you need someone to be. The farming thing is not going to be your future. At some point, you're going to have to make a decision about what you actually want your life to look like." I held the phone very still. Then I said, "What do you think my life looks like right now, Marcus?" He paused. "I think you're working very hard on something that probably isn't going to scale the way you want it to. I think you're alone in a city where you don't have much support. And I think you've been doing this long enough that if it was going to break through, it probably would have by now." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tell him about the grant or the patents or the Atlanta meeting or the partnership. I didn't tell him that the previous week, Priya had shown me a preliminary analysis suggesting our sensor data had helped cooperatives in our pilots reduce water usage by an average of 18% across the monitored growing season, a number that made me sit down because it was better than I had modeled. I just said, "Thank you for calling, Marcus," and I ended the conversation. That night, I sat with what he had said, and I let myself feel it fully, not to punish myself with it, but because I had learned that suppressing that kind of thing made it louder later. I let it hurt, and then I made a decision. I was done managing my family's comfort around my work. I was done softening the truth to protect them from feeling like they had misjudged me. I was done treating their doubt like it deserved a seat at my table. What I was not going to do was argue. What I was not going to do was announce. What I was going to do was exactly what I had been doing, only now without the small instinct that still reached toward their approval when I wasn't paying attention. I called Priya that night and told her I was ready to pursue the Fieldwork Alliance partnership formally. We had been moving carefully, making sure every piece of our data and our operational plan was solid before we committed. She said she had been waiting for me to say that. We set a meeting for Monday morning. Over the following 6 weeks, things moved faster than they had in 4 years. Fieldwork Alliance signed a letter of intent. Their board approved a 3-year integration plan. We were scheduled for a formal public launch announcement at their annual Agricultural Development Conference in Savannah in late April, an event that drew cooperative leaders, state agricultural officials, research institutions, and a significant number of journalists who covered rural development and food systems. Our name was going to be on the program. Our data was going to be presented in front of people who would immediately understand what it meant. And a technology investor named Sandra O'Coffer, who sat on Fieldwork Alliance's advisory board and had made her name backing infrastructure solutions in underserved markets, had quietly asked our nonprofit contact for an introduction. I had not told my family any of this, but my mother had called 3 times in the 2 weeks before the Savannah conference. Each time, she found a gentle way to circle back to the same point. You are not getting younger. Your brother has offered to connect you with people who could help you find something more sustainable. We only want what is best for you. The third call, 2 days before I drove to Savannah, I picked up and listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "I hear you, Mom." Then I told her I had a work trip and would call her when I was back. She said, "Work? I hope it's worth it, Nadia." I put the phone down. I finished packing. I printed 3 copies of our full data summary and placed them in a clean folder. I put the folder in my bag next to my laptop and the small GroundTrue sensor unit I had carried to every meeting for the past 2 years, the 3rd-generation prototype, worn at the edges, scratched from field use, still functional. I drove to Savannah early the next morning, 5 hours, coffee in a thermos, the folder on the passenger seat where the doubt used to be. I was not nervous in the way I had been at the first pilot. I was something quieter than nervous. I was ready in the way you get only after you have carried something long enough to stop questioning whether it deserves to be carried. Whatever happened in that conference room, my family had not prepared me for it, but they had not stopped it either. That was something. The Fieldwork Alliance conference was held at a riverfront hotel in Savannah. Not a luxury property, but a clean, well-organized space that felt appropriate for the kind of work the people in that room were doing. There were no flashy displays, no promotional gimmicks, just long tables, good lighting, and people who had spent careers in rooms that smelled like soil and policy documents, and the particular exhaustion of trying to help systems that move slowly. I arrived the evening before and walked the venue alone for about 20 minutes. I needed to understand the space before I stood in it with other people watching. I found the main presentation hall, checked where our session was listed on the printed program, and stood at the front of the room for a moment, just looking at the rows of chairs. There were going to be close to 200 people in that room the following morning: cooperative leaders from across the Southeast, state agricultural officials from 4 states, research faculty from 2 land-grant universities, representatives from federal agricultural development programs, and journalists. 5 had confirmed credentials, 2 of whom wrote for publications that specifically covered rural infrastructure and food system equity. Sandra Okafor was on the attendee list. I had confirmed that quietly through our Fieldwork Alliance contact the night before. She was listed as a board observer, which meant she would be present for the full morning session. I noted it and let it sit without building anything around it. I had learned by then that expectation was expensive when you couldn't control the outcome. I went back to my room, ordered food I barely tasted, reviewed the presentation one final time, and slept better than I had any right to. The morning session opened with remarks from Fieldwork Alliance's executive director, a tall, measured woman named Dr. Carolyn Marsh, who had spent 20 years in agricultural development before building the organization. She spoke about the gap between available agricultural technology and the farms that needed it most. She used words like access and proximity and scale in ways that were specific and grounded rather than abstract. The room was attentive in the way rooms get when the person speaking actually knows what they are talking about. Then she introduced our segment. She said GroundTrue had come to Fieldwork Alliance's attention through their cooperative partners in North Carolina, and that the pilot data had been among the most compelling they had reviewed in several years of evaluating field technology solutions. She said the organization had chosen to build a formal integration partnership because the approach was practical, the results were real, and the methodology respected the actual conditions that smallholder farmers worked in rather than the idealized conditions that most technology assumed. I walked to the front of the room carrying the scratched third-generation sensor unit and a small stack of printed summary sheets. I did not use a lot of slides. I had made a deliberate choice about that. Data on a screen is easy to half-watch. A real object in a real person's hands is harder to dismiss. I started with Mr. Del Rey. I told the room about the conversation that had started all of this, the family in Rowan County. The drainage problem that built for weeks before it became visible. The crop loss that didn't have to happen. I kept it brief, 1 minute, maybe less. But I watched the room as I said it, and I could see that people recognized it. Several of the cooperative leaders were nodding before I finished the sentence. Then I walked through the pilot data. Not all 47 pages, but the numbers that mattered. The early detection rates, the water usage reduction, the nutrient alerts that had allowed farmers to intervene before a problem became a loss. I described what the sensor network looked like in practice, how it was installed, what it cost per acre to operate, how the alert system worked for farmers without technical backgrounds, how we had calibrated the thresholds differently for different soil types after the Georgia pilot showed us where our assumptions had been wrong. I held up the sensor unit when I described the hardware. I passed 3 units around the room so people could hold them. A cooperative director from Alabama raised his hand halfway through and asked about maintenance burden. It was a good, practical question, the kind that comes from someone who has watched promising technology fail in the field because it assumed resources that didn't exist. I answered it directly and in detail. A research faculty member from the University of Georgia asked about our data validation methodology. I walked her through it. She asked a follow-up. I answered that too. The exchange lasted about 4 minutes, and I was aware, in the way you are sometimes aware of a room shifting its posture without anyone moving, that the people around us were listening more carefully than they had been before. When I finished, Dr. Marsh opened the floor for questions. There were 11. I answered all of them. The session ran 14 minutes over schedule, and Dr. Marsh let it run. Afterward, people came forward. Cooperative leaders who wanted to discuss their specific situations. A state official who asked about our integration timeline. 2 journalists who asked for follow-up conversations. I stayed at the front of the room for 40 minutes after the session ended, talking to each person in turn, and the scratched sensor unit sat on the table beside me the whole time, like it had always belonged there. Sandra Okafor found me near the end of that 40 minutes. She was shorter than I had expected, with a calm directness that reminded me a little of Priya when she was in analysis mode. She didn't introduce herself with her title or her fund. She said her name and then she said, "Your contamination detection case from the Georgia pilot. Walk me through how the alert actually reached the farmer." So I did, in detail. She asked questions that told me she already understood the technical framework and was testing whether I understood the operational reality around it. I did. We talked for 22 minutes, standing beside a table in a half-emptied conference room. At the end, she said, "Your unit economics are still rough, and your manufacturing timeline is optimistic." I said I knew. She said, "The data is real, and the problem is real, and those two things together are rarer than people think. I want to continue this conversation. Do you have a card?" I gave her one. She looked at it, looked at the sensor unit still on the table, and said, "How long have you been carrying that particular unit around?" I told her almost 2 years. She nodded once. "Good," she said. "People who carry things that long usually understand what they're building." I did not let myself react until she had walked away. Then I stood very still for a moment and looked at the sensor unit on the table, the scratched casing, the worn edge where I had dropped it once on a concrete floor in Durham and held my breath until I confirmed it still worked. I thought about that Sunday in October, the jollof rice, the folder beside my chair, Marcus leaning back with his comfortable certainty, my mother's word, little. I thought about the drive home in the dark, and then I thought about Doris, the cooperative manager in Harnett County, who had said the land was talking to her, and about the email we had received 2 months into the Georgia pilot from a farmer who had caught a contamination issue early enough to protect most of his crop, and had written to us in 3 short sentences that I had also printed and kept on my desk. I picked up the sensor unit. I put it in my bag. I called Kosi first. He made a sound that was mostly not words. I called Priya. She asked me to say it again more slowly so she could actually take it in. That evening, I sat on the small balcony of my hotel room looking at the Savannah River, and I thought about whether to call my family. Not to announce anything, just to talk, the way I used to before the distance between us had become the shape it was now. I didn't call. Not because I was punishing them, but because the moment felt like mine, and I had learned to protect things that were mine until they were ready to be shared. My phone had 12 messages by the time I went back inside. None of them were from my family. All of them were from people I had met that day. That was the room shifting. Not loudly, not dramatically, the way real things shift, one careful degree at a time. The conversation with Sandra Okafor did not move quickly. I want to say that clearly because this kind of story is often told as if one good meeting becomes a changed life overnight. It doesn't work that way. What it becomes is a different kind of pressure, the pressure of possibility, which is harder to carry in some ways than the pressure of doubt, because at least with doubt, you know what you're managing. Sandra's firm requested our full data package 2 weeks after Savannah. I sent it. Her team came back with 31 questions. I answered all 31. They requested a site visit to one of our pilot locations. Kofi and I drove to Harnett County on a Tuesday in May and spent 4 hours in the field with 2 of Sandra's analysts, walking them through the sensor network, showing them how the alert system worked in practice, letting them pull the data logs and compare them against the farmer's own records. Doris was there that day. She showed the analysts the section of the field where we had flagged a drainage issue the previous season. She pointed at the soil the way someone points at something they are still slightly amazed by. She said, "I've been farming this land for 30 years, and this is the first season one went into harvest without losing sleep over what I didn't know." One of the analysts wrote something in her notebook. The other one took a photograph of the sensor unit in the ground. I stood a few feet back and let Doris talk. That was intentional. The most credible thing I could do in that moment was let someone else tell the truth. 6 weeks after the site visit, Sandra's firm issued a term sheet. The number was significant. Not the kind of number that changes what a word means, but the kind that removes a specific category of fear permanently. The investment would fund full commercial manufacturing, a dedicated sales and implementation team, expanded research partnerships, and an acceleration of the Fieldwork Alliance integration across all 3 states. I read the term sheet 4 times at my kitchen table. Then I made coffee. Then I called my lawyer. The negotiations took 5 weeks. There were moments where I thought it might collapse over terms around IP control, which I refused to concede on in ways that made the process uncomfortable for a while. Sandra respected that eventually. She said later that founders who protect their core technology during negotiation are usually the ones who understand what they actually built. We signed in late July. On a Wednesday morning, in a conference room in Raleigh, with Kofi and Priya sitting across from Sandra's team and 2 lawyers on each side of the table. When it was done, I shook hands with everyone, collected my copy of the signed documents, and walked to my car in the parking garage. I sat there for a while. Not long, maybe 10 minutes. I thought about the grant letter I had read alone at 7 in the morning, about the pilot data nobody had asked to see, about Marcus on the phone telling me that if it was going to break through, it probably would have by now, about my mother's carefully chosen word, little. Then I started the car and drove back to the office because there was still work to do. The news became public 6 days later through a press release that Sandra's communications team issued in coordination with Fieldwork Alliance. The headline described a significant investment in a soil monitoring technology platform developed for smallholder agriculture, with a named partnership covering cooperative networks across 4 southeastern states. Technology publications picked it up. 2 agricultural trade journals ran pieces. A reporter from a regional business publication who had been at the Savannah conference wrote a longer profile that included our pilot data, quotes from Doris, and a photograph of the 3rd-generation sensor unit sitting in a field in Harnett County. My phone started receiving messages before I had finished reading the press release myself. Kofi sent a voice note that was too loud for headphones. Priya sent a photograph of the bell she had been ringing every time a new shelter signed on in someone else's story, which made me smile because it was exactly the kind of detail that belonged to us. Dr. Marsh from Fieldwork Alliance sent a formal note that was warm underneath its professional language. Sandra sent 3 words: "You earned this." Then came the other messages. Marcus called first. He called at 11:14 in the morning. I know the time because I looked at my phone, saw his name, and put it face down on my desk. He called again at 11:40. Then a text. "Nadia, I saw the news. Call me when you can." My father called at noon. He left a voicemail. I listened to it that evening. His voice was formal in the careful way it gets when he is managing his own discomfort. He said he had seen the announcement and that it was clearly a significant development. He said he hoped I knew the family had always believed in my capacity for success. He said he would like to have a conversation when I had time. I played it twice. Then I set my phone down and looked out the window for a minute. My mother called 4 times between noon and 3 in the afternoon. She did not leave a voicemail. She texted instead. "Nadia, sweetheart, we are so proud of you. Please call us." Then, an hour later, I had no idea the scope of what you were building. Then, just before 3, "Family should be together for something like this. Please call." I read all 3 messages. I did not reply that day. My cousin Adez, who had made the houseplant joke at the October dinner, posted a comment on the regional business publications article about GroundTrue. She wrote, "So proud of my cousin. We always knew she was going to do something incredible." I stared at that sentence long enough that Priya noticed and asked what I was looking at. I showed her. Priya said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "People rewrite history so fast, it should be a sport." That made me laugh for the first time all day. Over the following week, the messages accumulated. Extended family members I had not heard from in years sent congratulations with the particular warmth of people who want to be associated with a good outcome. A family friend who had asked me twice at Christmas gatherings whether I was still doing the soil thing said she had always known I had something special. Marcus sent a longer text 2 days after his first call. He said he was proud of me. He said he wanted to be honest, that he had underestimated what I was building, and that he was sorry for that. He said he hoped we could talk. I read it 3 times. Then I put my phone in my bag and went back to a manufacturing call with Kofi. I did eventually call my mother, not because the calls wore me down, but because I had decided what I wanted to say, and I needed to say it while it was still clean. She answered on the first ring. She said my name in the way she says it when she is relieved, with the extra syllable she adds when she is emotional. She said, "Nadia, I am so sorry. I should have listened better. I should have asked more questions. I should have been the kind of mother who understood what you were doing instead of worrying about what it looked like from the outside." I sat with that for a moment. It was the most honest thing she had said to me in years, maybe longer. I said, "I know you love me, Mom. I have never doubted that. What I needed was for love to include curiosity, for it to ask questions instead of offer corrections, for it to trust that I understood my own life well enough to be building the right thing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I did not ask enough questions." "No," I said, "you didn't." She asked if we could start over. I told her starting over wasn't quite the right frame, that what I wanted was something slower and more honest than what we had before, that I wasn't interested in returning to Sunday lunches where my work was called little and then being expected to show up again the following month as if nothing had been said, that if we were going to rebuild anything, it would have to be on different terms. She said she understood. I believed she was trying to. With Marcus, I was briefer. He called again on a Thursday evening, and I answered. He said the same things his text had said, with more words around them. I let him finish. Then I told him that his certainty on that phone call in January had been the kind of certainty that closes doors for people who are standing right on the edge of something real. That words from a trusted person at the wrong moment carry weight that casual people don't account for. That I had kept going, not because of what he said, but in spite of it, and that I wanted him to understand the difference. He was quiet for longer than I expected. Then he said, "You're right. I said what I thought I knew, and I didn't actually know anything about what you were building. That was enough. Not everything, but enough for that evening. I didn't go back to Sunday dinners that fall, not immediately. I needed distance to stay clear. I needed to protect the version of myself I had built in the quiet years from being slowly softened back into something more convenient for the people around me. What I did instead was go back to Harnett County on a Saturday in August. Just me. No meetings, no analysts, no presentations. I drove out to the cooperative and walked the fields with Doris for about an hour while she checked on the late-season crops. The sensors were in the ground, the data was running. Everything was working the way it was supposed to. At one point, Doris stopped and looked out over the field and said, "You know what I think about sometimes?" I said, "What?" She said, "I think about all the harvests I lost before you showed up." Not with bitterness, she clarified quickly. Just, I think about them. Because those losses were real, and now this is real. Both things are true. I stood there for a while after she said that. Both things are true. The years I spent being dismissed were real, and what I had built in spite of that dismissal was also real. I did not need my family to have believed in me earlier for the work to matter. I did not need their approval retroactively applied to years they had spent looking in a different direction. The work existed independent of their witness. That was the thing I carried home that evening, back to my apartment in Raleigh, back to the kitchen table where I had read the grant letter alone at 7 in the morning, back to the ordinary quiet of a life that had never looked like much from the outside. My phone was calmer by then. The congratulation wave had settled. The family messages had slowed to something more manageable. Kofi had sent a photo of the first commercial manufacturing run, 20 units in clean packaging, lined up on a workbench in the production facility. Priya had sent a spreadsheet update with a note that just said, "We're actually doing this." I made tea. I sat at the table. I looked at Kofi's photo for a long time. I thought about the folder I had carried to that October dinner, the 47 pages nobody had asked to read, the drive home in the dark with doubt on one side and the work on the other. The quiet I had chosen when explaining stopped feeling worth the cost. I didn't need them to have seen it sooner. I needed to have kept going anyway. I had. That was the whole story, really. Not the investment, not the press release, not the moment Sandra said I earned this, or the moment Doris said the land was talking to her. The whole story was the years in between, the invisible middle. The work that happened when nobody was watching, and nobody was particularly impressed, and the only reason to continue was that the reason was real. If you have ever been in that middle place, the place between proof and collapse, the place where the people who should believe in you have already decided who you are, then you already understand the only thing that actually matters. Keep going. Not for them, not to prove them wrong, because the work is real and because you are the only person who can do it the way you do it. That is worth more than their approval ever was.